Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michelle Miner. I'm the producer of the History Lecture Series, for those of you who don't know me. Anyone that is here that is not on our mailing list and would like to join that, there's a sign up at the table in the lobby. Also, Dr. Kolb will be out afterwards to sell more books if you still have some, and talk to you all like you usually stay around to do. Few items of just housekeeping, I should say. Make sure if you brought anything in with you this evening, you bring it out when you leave and throw it away in the garbage cans out front, if you wouldn't mind. Tonight's presentation is about women and the Battle of New Orleans, and the Battle of New Orleans always stirs some people that we don't usually see, so welcome back for you guys. Dr. Kolb I looked at her curriculum vitae and was like, wow. The list of publications and different endeavors that she's done is unbelievably long. She is currently teaching as an adjunct at Tulane University in history. She has a BA in English, a master's in history, and a doctorate in urban studies and urban history. And her knowledge is it's unbelievable. I'm not going to keep you because I know I wrote a lot about her in the program. I'm just going to introduce you to Dr. Carolyn Kolb.
Okay, I'm going to test my mic. Is this mic working?
Okay, let's see what we got to do.
It's green.
It is green.
Maybe the volume needs to turn on?
Maybe so.
Is there a volume thing?
No, he controls the volume upstairs.
If you control the volume upstairs, turn it up.
All right.
Hello?
When we don't have any mic. Check, 1, 2. Nothing. Sorry,
Whoa,
guys.
wait, is that working?
No, it's not. Oh, he must have cut it off to put that one on.
Oh, well, if
There you go.
Wow.
There we go, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Okay. All right. 204 years ago this coming January, in typical miserable Louisiana winter weather, our forefathers were slogging around in a muddy Chalmette field between the river and the swamp, stiff with cold, with smarting eyes from the smoke of powder, and probably half death from repeated gunfire. Most of our foremothers were somewhere else. I have found no Creole Molly Pitchers or Cajun Barbara Fritchies, but that doesn't mean there were no women around. There were interesting women peripherally involved in the Battle of New Orleans, and some females were unlucky enough to be present in the battlefield area. Someone was probably doing the laundry, mending the clothes, and nursing the sick. The battle was fought in what was a sparsely populated section with a few plantations, resident families, and a workforce in residence prior to the battle. Although the big battle was on January the 8th, the forces were already gathering. Plus, there had been confrontations between the British and Americans for some weeks. Women were indeed present for some of these engagements. In fact, on New Year's Day, Andrew Jackson had invited New Orleans citizens to come down to Chalmette and to see his troops and preparations. Apparently, several carriages arrived, including local ladies, for the grand review. The band was playing and the local companies were in their finest regalia, were marching on parade when the British started firing. The McCarty plantation being used as headquarters was hit at least 100 times. The Americans had to run catch all the horses who stampeded in fright, and of course the carriages hurriedly rolled off for town. So for the moment, we will leave the beleaguered general, who was so miserable with a case of dysentery at the time that a few Orleanians couldn't have bothered him, and set the stage for the grand battle to come by reviewing a little history, and from the feminine view when possible. While history for centuries was concerned mostly with great men, rulers, generals, tycoons, for the last half century or so, more attention had been paid to those lower in the pecking order, the general population, the regular people, the women. Trying to get past the fact that there may not be as many personal written records available on these people, say diaries, by being creative and pulling out data, by reading between the lines, we now know more about these previously little-known ancestors. We can learn from ships' passenger manifest, from census records, from legal documents such as wills, from church registers. French and Spanish colonies may not have always been efficiently run, but they kept records of everything. According to the most recent census for that time, taken in 1810, there were 3,466 white females in New Orleans and its surrounding area. The total population was 24,552. So if you imagine that the city in 1815 was just a little smaller than, say, Slidell today, you'd be about right. It was one of the 6 biggest cities in the country. And if you took exports as a measurement, the port of New Orleans was second only to New York. All those harvests from Middle America came down the Mississippi and would do so until the Erie Canal in 1825 made it easier to get to New York, and the local port figures started to decline. Besides those 3,400 white women, 43% of the white population, there were probably about 2,500 free women of color and 4,500 women who were slaves. Because of a sharp rise in population due to an influx of refugees, both white and black, fleeing the revolution in the Caribbean island of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, a large percentage of Orleanians were French speakers. Besides the Native American females, there had been women in Louisiana from the earliest years. One of LaSalle's expeditions in 1684 had included women and children. And things were so bad for them that they had to join in the hunt if they wanted to eat. And sometimes they had to use the same musket ball 4 times. That unfortunate venture had only a few survivors, all men. When John Law's Company of the Indies took over the Louisiana colony, one of the 3 biggest investors was a woman, Catherine Barre, wife of the king's secretary, Antoine Chaumont. Madame Chaumont's property was actually around where Pascagoula is located now, and she paid so little attention to it that at one point no one had heard from her for 3 years, and local administrators were frantically writing to Paris. The French were keenly aware that women were the key to permanent settlement, and the official records make frequent note of this. However, it was difficult enough to get anyone to go to Louisiana in the early years. The king might want young French women to emigrate and be wives for his soldiers, but Bienville, who was right on the spot, described those same army recruits and prospective grooms as stunted creatures 4.5 feet tall, as corrupt as they are cowardly. Presumably, what few eligible men available in France after the 100 Years' War were even less attractive, because women came to New Orleans and of their own free will. Even a few free black women arrived of their own accord. Ships' registries list midwives, bakers, cooks, dressmakers. In short, most women's occupations were represented from the earliest days. And there were also women merchants, white, black, and Indian, who could be found selling foodstuffs and other goods in the French market or on the street. This was an aspect of New Orleans street life that remained constant through the years. We can also surmise that there were females with a less acceptable occupation who could be found on the city's thoroughfares also. The fact was, some women had to support themselves. Women may have been performers, singers, actresses. The first opera we know of that was performed in the city was in 1796. The 1810 census listed numerous women as widows or living alone or with their children or other female relatives. They had some source of income. They might even have kept boarding houses. John Latrobe in his journals described Mrs. Wosters as being very genteel in 1834. And no doubt there were similar establishments 20 years earlier. They could be hairdressers. If at the age of 14, Marie Laveau greeted the Battle of New Orleans by burning candles and making gris-gris against the British, She might also have been heating up the curling irons if she did follow that occupation. And she could have been cheering on various friends and relatives in the ranks of the free men of color who took up arms on the American side. Marie would have taken a personal interest in the battle. The British invasion's most immediate effect on women was the forced absence of husbands, fathers, and sons. Madame de Vence Bienvenue, a rich widow of the Attakapas country, sent her 4 sons to the militia. Since all they could earn was $8 a month, this could not be considered a good career move for the boys. The loyal Madame Bienvenue even wrote Governor Claiborne volunteering her own services to care for the wounded. A Mrs. Rosalie Delande, who lived just upriver from the battlefield, did give her house over as a hospital, and she put in a claim for damages to the American government after the battle. Some women hosted the combatants. As Andrew Jackson and his men marched to the battle from a starting point near today's Florida, they prepared to cross the Pearl River at Angie, Louisiana, north of Bogalusa on the tip of Louisiana's boot. John Ford, staunch Methodist and early Mississippi settler, had a home in what is now Sandy Hook, Mississippi. It's still there. Jackson approached and asked to camp his troops there. Legend has it that Mrs. Ford requested that Jackson stay outside in his tent since she had heard the general was fond of cussing. Over in St. Tammany Parish, there's a legend that Daniel Edwards invited the general to spend his night on the way to the battle. Mrs. Edwards was expecting at the time, and the couple would name the baby Andrew Jackson Edwards. What Mrs. Edwards had to say about her husband's insistence on inviting a houseguest with dysentery is not recorded. There was one group of New Orleans women who faced different but unique problems of their own. These were the Ursuline nuns, and they do figure prominently in the battle's outcome, being responsible for the divine intervention, which along with the attendant marksmanship and soldiery would carry the day. The 100 Years' War had depleted the male population of France, sharply increased the number of single women in the early 1700s. One result was a rise in vocations. Nearly 20% of French females at the time were in religious orders. The Ursulines had been founded back in 1540. On founding them, Pope Paul III had commented to the also recently formed Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, "I have given you sisters." So it was fitting that both would be missionaries to the North American wilderness. Bienville's mother, Catherine Primo, had been educated by the Ursulines in Montreal, so he would have been well disposed to the order, and although they were not the first choice, they eventually agreed to staff a New Orleans convent. When the first nuns arrived in 1727, they were led by Mother Tranchepin, who had been a Protestant. One of the number was bright 19-year-old Marie-Madeleine Achard. Her description of the nuns' arrival in New Orleans was the source of a later painting by artist Poincy. Let's see. Look for the girl in the yellow cap. And I'm trying to figure out how to turn this thing on. I know it's something on the back. Well, at any rate, you can see that there's a woman about 4 heads from the other side who has a tall cap on. That's a cap for a novice. And if you look closely, she's holding a cat. That's her pet she brought from France. Well, that's what Madeleine said. She was very funny. She had one in her diary, she once said, "People here say New Orleans is just like Paris. I say, those are people who've never been to Paris." By 1815, Marie-Madeleine had been dead for over half a century, and the nuns were thriving at their convent on Charter Street with 28 orphans and a school for 80 students among their various ventures. At the Louisiana Purchase, some nuns had been moved to a convent in Cuba, but having been reassured in writing by President Thomas Jefferson, the nuns felt safe in remaining in American territory at their New Orleans home. Later in France, Mother Saint-Michel Jansu was concerned and asked the Pope for permission to go to Louisiana. She made devotions to Our Lady of Prompt Succor, and the necessary papers speedily arrived. When she left France, she took her devotions and her statue with her, arriving in 1810. When conflicts with England evolved into the War of 1812, the British plans ultimately led to a three-pronged attack. From Canada into the mid-Atlantic states, aiming at Washington, D.C., and up through the Gulf of Mexico. The Americans fended off the venture from Canada. The English managed to burn the White House, and the plans for the Gulf finally centered on the dominant port of New Orleans. In New Orleans, the resident Creole population would have to join with the brash new American political powers and merchants to defend their city. William C.C. Claiborne, a Virginian, was Thomas Jefferson's choice to govern Louisiana. Claiborne had lost his first Nashville-born wife, Eliza Lewis, to yellow fever, and his second wife, Clarice Durald of Louisiana, bore him a son, but also died of the disease. His third wife, local Creole Sophronie Bosquet, brought him a fortune and had 3 sons. Claiborne had local family connections and wisely used them. The war approached. Andrew Jackson took charge. The city would remain under martial law for the time being. Jackson pragmatically put his defenses together. Local militias, his own army unit, forces coming downriver from Tennessee and Kentucky. He welcomed the militias of the free people of color. Jackson even struck a bargain with Jean Lafitte's privateer forces, who brought along French-trained gunners with their own artillery and shells. Helping put that combination together was a wily American attorney, Edward Livingston, who seemed to have everyone in town as a client at one time, including Lafitte. Livingston had already served in Congress from New York, been mayor of New York City. Livingston would go on to work on revising and codifying Louisiana's French-based laws and would later become Andrew Jackson's Secretary of State. The widowed Livingston would marry in Louisiana a 19-year-old widow, Louise Davisac. She was a refugee from the Haitian Revolution. According to a wedding notice in a Virginia newspaper, she was elegant in person and majestic in manners. Louise was also clever and was obviously helpful to her son in Louisiana circles. As the city prepared for battle, the women had work to do. The Kentucky and Tennessee troops were woefully unprepared for cold weather. Ice was recorded on the ground in January. So the Louisiana legislature spent $16,000 on woolen blankets and fabric. It was the women of Louisiana who sewed clothing for the troops from the fabric. In just a week's time, they produced 1,200 cloaks, 1,100 pair of pants, 800 shirts, and 400 pair of shoes, plus a number of mattresses. On the British side, there were some very interested ladies awaiting the results of the battle. These were the soldiers' wives who had accompanied the invaders. It seems probable that the English were intent not only on defeating the American armies, but on occupying and settling in to colonize Louisiana. Admiral Cochrane, the commanding Scottish naval officer, probably had his eye on the estimated millions in trade goods that would become the property of the occupying military men. Just as sailors split up prize money for seized enemy ships, the New Orleans invasion was to become a well-paying proposition for these men in the British forces. In fact, that's probably why New Orleans and not Mobile was the target of choice. The British fleet contained both civil administrators who would take over the New Orleans government and the wives and families of soldiers. The 93rd Scots Highlanders even brought along 104 of their children. The officers may have been mercenaries at heart, but there was no truth to the unauthorized rumor, we're all familiar with that term, that the British passwords for the day were beauty and booty. This carries an undercurrent of accusing the enemy of having lascivious aims at local womenfolk. It's just not true. The commanding general of the English was not married, but he could certainly claim an interesting sister. Edward, known as Ned Pakenham, was the younger brother of Kitty, the wife of Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Both families were Anglo-Irish. Kitty, shy and bookish, would have a difficult marriage. In fact, her brother, who looked very much like her, would do his best to keep the couple happy. Pakenham had joined the Army at 16. He started as a lieutenant, became a captain in 3 days, and in 6 months was a major. All those commissions were purchased. By the time he was 22, he was a lieutenant colonel. The first time he saw action was when he commanded a British force in Ireland in 1798 against some French invaders. The French were commanded by General Jean-Marie Humbert, who would turn up on the American side in New Orleans, even after Jackson declined his offer to direct the entire campaign. Pakenham was described by Wellington as, quote, not the greatest genius, but one of the best we have, unquote. Ned was on his brother-in-law's staff during the Peninsula Campaign when the English fought the French through Spain and Portugal. They were victorious, saw Napoleon into exile, and in the months before Napoleon's surprising return, many officers went home. Pakenham wrote his mother, I think I have escaped America and shall consider myself vastly fortunate to have been spared such a service. In the next letter he admitted, the affairs in America have gone ill. Staff officers have become necessary, and I have been called by the ministers to proceed to the other side of the Atlantic. I confess to you that there is nothing that makes this employment desirable. And indeed, Pakenham had to race in after Admiral Cochrane was well into the invasion, and Pakenham only arrived at the scene at Christmas. A poor battle site, supply lines that were too long, impossible terrain and weather, plus the surprising ingenuity and creative defense put up by Andrew Jackson using his motley crew, everything combined to defeat the young commander. Pakenham's family figured in his one recorded romantic adventure. He once proposed to a very eligible young heiress, Annabella Milbank. She was many years his junior, but she seemed to enjoy his military anecdotes. Then the relationship cooled. She began to think, quote, his manners are rather too silken, and finally rejected his suit, saying that all the Pakenham family have strong family tendency to insanity. Well, there was a brother who was given to black moods, but most researchers think the Pakenhams were no dottier than most of the Anglo-Irish at the time. Annabella's own judgment might be called into question. After all, I just blew something. Oh, I know whose ghost it is. Lord Byron. That's who Annabella married. And the best that people could say about him was that he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. There was one British officer in Chalmette who did marry and live happily ever after. General Harry Smith had met a 14-year-old girl in Spain while on campaign. He first took her in for protection, but he soon fell madly in love. Juana Smith, who was a great beauty, would be a fine wife for him. She usually followed him to all his postings, but while he was in New Orleans, she remained in England. He was to rise rapidly in the Army and was eventually knighted. On station in South Africa, Juana Smith was so beloved by the colonists that the whole town was named for her, and Lady Smith it is today. While the battle was raging in Chalmette on the home front in New Orleans, the ladies were coping as best they could. Eliza Gould was visiting New Orleans with her mother, and the two women were unable to return to a family plantation for fear of a British-inspired slave insurrection. Involvement in the battle of the largest number of slaves was in earth-moving and construction work for the American side. While the British expressed surprise at the Americans' swiftly and well-constructed battle lines, the slaves who did the work got little or no credit. Yet, very few slaves chose to aid or flee with the British, and there was no uprising. Women remained in the city for some 2 weeks while available males were occupied in Chalmette. Local government had to provide food for some, but everyone had to live with the fear and the sound of cannon fire. Ms. Gould, from a residence on Royal Street, admitted that they had food, but such was the state of our minds that we scarcely took an undisturbed meal. Gould noted that the French-speaking women in the house across the street would occasionally venture outside, then become frightened and go back in screaming, "Fermez la porte, fermez la porte," close the door. The ever-resourceful Louise Livingston wrote her sister about the tense mood of waiting in the city for news of the battle. "All I can say, dear sister, is that people do not often die of it, ever great the anguish of such hours." Wounded and sick with fever, British and American soldiers fled to the city from the battlefield. Louise Livingston took in a British officer who had been wounded. The Ursulines sent their boarding students home and used the dormitory to care for the wounded. One nun, Sister Angele Johnson, who spoke English, was especially helpful. Meanwhile, the Ursulines knew exactly what to do. They prayed. Our Lady of Prompt Succor answered. While they were at Mass in their chapel, news of the victory was announced. In gratitude, they sang a Te Deum. I don't know if you all can remember that WWL radio used to have a little message from a Jesuit every day, and he always started off by singing this hymn, "Holy God, we praise thy name." I did not realize that that's actually a Te Deum. That's the English version of a Te Deum. So at any rate, the nuns were definitely singing it in thanks. Mother Saint Olivier de Vezin pledged an annual Mass of Thanksgiving on the date every year thereafter, and there's still one each year on January 8. The goodwill that prevailed after the victory led to some odd encounters between the Creoles and the pioneers. 18Dec13 invited Americans General Coffee and General Carroll to visit him, presumably at his plantation near today's Audubon Park. General Carroll was around for so long that it's possible Carrollton might be named for him. The general stayed with their host for many weeks, driving the ladies of the household to despair with their manners. They would, it seems, put their feet on the table after supper to take their brandy. Poor Monsieur Bourret, he could only plead that it must be the custom of their country. Jackson, even victorious, could still be annoying, what with wanting to try a legislator for treason. He wouldn't even let all the militia go home, even with the Archbishop pleading that the women of the Morgan City area were starving. The one bright spot in Jackson's final sojourn in town was the visit of his wife. Rachel Jackson, who had by mishap married him while her divorce was not yet final, was 47, a stout and homely figure who'd never seen a town bigger than Nashville. Louise Livingston took her in, tried her best to dress her suitably, and took up a collection to buy her some jewelry. Rachel went everywhere, balls, concerts, plays, theaters, etc., but we don't attend the half of them, she wrote. Local merchant Vincent Nolte, the novel Anthony Adverse is based on his autobiography, dryly remarked after a ball, "To see these two figures, the general, a long, haggard man with limbs like a skeleton, and Madame le Général, a short, fat dumpling, bobbing opposite each other to the wild melody of Possum Up the Gum Tree, was very remarkable." Although she was in France while the battle raged, one Arlenian cared very much about the event. Okay. Madame Pontalba had a personal stake in the Battle of New Orleans. Michaela Almonesta Pontalba was the granddaughter of Marguerite Brutin, wife of Louis Xavier de Chalmette, from whom Chalmette gets its name. The French term Chalmette referred to pasture or untilled land, particularly in the mountains. Louis Xavier Chalmette had a son, Ignace, by another wife, and this son's wife, Victorine, and daughter, Azalie, were Michaela's dearest friends. The worldly Michaela faithfully wrote to her country relatives, regaling them with her adventures. One time in the 1830s, she wrote Azalie a letter and said she wished she could come to see her in a balloon. They had had a balloon ascension in Paris, and she saw it, and she wrote her cousins and said, "I wish I could come home to New Orleans in a balloon right now." Victorine and her husband lived on the family plantation in Chalmette, and unfortunately, it was completely destroyed in the battle. They weren't able to save anything. After only a short time, weeks, Ignace died, probably of grief. Victorine lived for 2 decades more. The nearby Delerand house, this is supposedly a photograph from 1866. It's possible. The house totally burned up in the 1870s. But it's possible that that is an 1866 photograph. New Orleans had photographers pretty early on, almost as soon as Daguerre had invented the daguerreotype. Somebody learned it and came over here. When Michaela in later years toured America, the nearby Delerand house was the home of Michaela's Uncle Pierre, her mother's youngest brother. When Michaela in later years toured America, Andrew Jackson, as president, sent his own carriage and Secretary of State to bring her to the White House when she visited Washington. I think back that time it was not Livingston. It was another Secretary of State. In her other connection to Jackson, her Fontalba buildings flank Jackson Square, the old Place d'Armes, renamed to honor the hero of the battle and centered by Clark Mill's equestrian statue of him. Of all the oddities when researching women in the Battle of New Orleans, perhaps the strangest is the English author Mary Wollstonecraft. She is known in one way as the mother of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, wife of the poet and author of Frankenstein. But in her own right, Mary Wollstonecraft is more important for her feminist philosophy, as expressed in her work, Vindication of the Rights of Women, which took the tenets of the Enlightenment and applied them to females. Her works were controversial in her time, but her importance is acknowledged today. Mrs. Wollstonecraft, like many another successful author, was plagued by having to support various family members, including her youngest brother, Charles. He did not succeed at the law, nor could he farm, nor did he thrive when shipped off to Ireland. Finally, she sent him to America, and mercifully for her, he never came back. As it turned out, he joined the U.S. Army, and the Battle of New Orleans found him in charge of an artillery unit down at Fort St. Philip. He lived through the War of 1812 and died a brevet major. In the first celebration of the victory, women played significant roles in the public ceremony of solemn thanksgiving. That is, elite young white women took part, and a commemorative verse was written by a female. After that, women took no part in public commemorative celebrations. But women's service was not forgotten by everyone. In the 1840s, Bernard de Marigny, as part of a campaign to allow continue requiring 2 years residency before citizenship, rather than increase the wait to 5 years, praised Louisiana women of both the French and American communities, some of those French being newly arrived, for their help during the military crisis. Louisiana women would have fought bravely themselves, Marigny asserted. More than one lady would have assumed an Amazon costume and taken the lance, and New Orleans would also have had its Joan of Arc. It would be decades before women again took center stage in commemorating the great victory. However, in 1893, the Chalmette chapter of the National Society of the United States Daughters of 1812 was formed and stepped up to the task. The women took on the challenge of finishing the obelisk memorial on the battlefield, which had been lingering since 1851. The monument was finally completed in 1908, and the daughters remained its caretakers until 1929, when the federal government assumed maintenance cost. Their service extends to the present day. The Daughters of 1812 continued to annually observe the anniversary of the battle with a wreath-laying ceremony on the banks of the Mississippi River. This properly reminds us all that a battle takes effort, not just from the combatants, but from their supporters of both sexes, and they all deserve recognition. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kolb. Would you be open for questions?
Oh, sure.
Does anybody have a question? No? Okay.
Oh, somebody must have a question.
The British soldiers that were wounded severely were taken to the city, from what I understand.
Well, you could probably catch the number somewhere. I know they had a couple of doctors who were with the British who stayed in New Orleans. One of them ended up running Charity Hospital. I can't think of his name right now, but some of the doctors did just stay in town.
Mr. Shelman died just a few months after the battle without being paid. Was Mrs. Shelman ever paid?
Well, it wasn't the Chalmettes who put in the claim. Well, yeah, actually it was. I don't think they ever got anything much. They just weren't too good on paying back stuff. They did stay in court for a long time. But whatever it was, it wasn't very much. Victorine kind of stayed poor. Well, surely people, yes.
That first picture you had up there doesn't look anything like the Battle of New Orleans pictures that we've seen here.
Well, it probably is just an artistic rendering. It was by a man named Laclotte, who was a painter, and it's being fought on the right side of the river. I well remember a mural at a bar in the French Quarter where the entire Battle of New Orleans was being fought on the West Bank. It was the Bourbon House. But it's on the right side of the river, so no, it may not look too great, but that was kind of close.
All right, Dr. Kolb, thank you so much for your
Well,
time
thank
and
you
your
all.
interesting information.